Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while. Hi, everybody. Welcome again to the Behavioral Corner. I'm Steve Martirano, one of the world's great hanger-outers. I figure if I stand on the street corner long enough, I'll run into a lot of interesting people, and that's usually been our great good luck. Today's no different. Our guest has done some fascinating work in an area that, well, obviously is much in the news, much on our minds, and that is about race. You've seen the commercials on television. I know you have. These consumer genetic tests companies, 23andMe and Ancestry.com. These companies have compelling ads. They're very emotional, and they offer the promise of revealing something to us. I guess which relatives we can be proud of and which relatives we keep in the closet or something like that. But that's one of the questions I wanted to ask our guest. Wendy Roth is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Her specialty is in race and genetics as well as immigration, and she's taken a look at those companies from an interesting perspective, not so much about their efficacy, although I want to get into that with her, but what the effect of their results are on the people who paid for them. So it's really an interesting area, and I'm so grateful for her time. Wendy, may I call you Wendy?
Yes, please.
Wendy, thanks for joining us on the Behavioral Corner. Let me begin with the kind of dumb guy questions I get paid to ask. First of all, two things. What are people who sign up for these tests looking for? What do they expect to find out? And what were you looking for, watching them look for it?
Okay, good question. So I don't want to suggest that there's only, one kind of person who takes these tests or that everybody is going in with the same experience. But I think there are a lot of people who take these tests to find out more about their family history, to find out something more than what they've got in their records, their family tree, or their genealogy. And there are some people who are very invested in research about their family history, and they use these tests as a sort of another step to help them in that research. Then there are a lot of people who take these tests not necessarily knowing much, but thinking, hey, I'll just see what I find out. Maybe I'll find out an interesting story. Maybe I'll find out that I have a different ancestry than I expected. Maybe I'll find out something amazing or surprising or shocking. And so there are a lot of people who come to these for different reasons. There are also people who take these tests basically to bridge a gap in the historical record. And here I'm thinking particularly about certain groups who have lost a lot of their documentation about their family's past. So African Americans who often don't have any documentation about where in Africa their ancestors came from before they were forcefully brought into the slave trade, or a lot of Jews whose family records were destroyed either during World War II or before with various pogroms and various regimes that were, trying to wipe out these populations. So there are also people who feel like this is a way to kind of connect back to a past that they felt had been lost.
Yeah, it's easy to understand in that context. There's the other context, I guess, of people who were adopted and cut off from their biological parents who have a desperate need to know about that. So that's certainly understandable. So let me before I asked about what you were looking at as they were availing themselves of the service. What do we know about the efficacy of these tests? How accurate are they?
So I get this question a lot. And what I like to say is that it's not so much a question of accuracy as it is a question of misunderstanding. Because what the big problem is that people just don't understand how to read and how to interpret the tests. Not that they're necessarily inaccurate, but that a lot of people look at these tests that have been very largely simplified and they honestly just take them as being much more definitive than they're meant to be, than they are. And that's partly the way the companies are presenting them. So you've probably all seen these commercials that show you a pie chart, right? A pie chart that says you are, X% this and Y% that. So people think, oh, that's me. That's my ancestry. My ancestry is X% this and Y% that. That's not what it means. It's, a much more technical understanding of what they're looking at. What they're doing is they're looking at a certain number of places in your genetic code, and they're saying of those particular spots, those markers, how many of them tend to be associated most often with this population versus that population. So really what it's saying is, let's say 26% of your ancestry is, or rather 26% of those markers are most often associated with the British Isles than with any other population in their database. But that doesn't mean that you have British Isles ancestry. You could have gotten that marker through a totally different population. So people look at that and they say, oh, 26% British Isles, that's who I am. But that's really not what these tests are telling you.
Yeah.
But, there are a lot of other ways in which they get misinterpreted. One is also that they have a margin of error that isn't always clear to people. So, again, it's not this very clear, definitive sounding percentage.
Sure.
Somewhere within the range, there's a chance that you have.
Yeah. Well, with that range of ambiguity and openness to interpretation, I could see where your field of study would come in, because there's a real danger that some misconceptions and falsehoods could be strengthened. But even before we get to that, when we say race, what do we mean when we say race? I mean, some people will tell you, well, there's only one race. What is the truth of that matter?
So I'm going to give you the understanding of it that sociologists have, right? I'm a sociologist. So I understand it as race is a set of categories that refer to certain aspects of people's biology or their ancestry, but there's nothing in the biology itself that says, I am in this category, I am in this group. These are categories that are imposed by people to basically say, we want to group you together, and we want to group you together. And I'm going to do this on the basis of your skin color, or I'm going to do this on the basis of how your eyes look, or I'm going to do this on the basis of the fact that one of your grandparents, was Native American or was Black, or according to these rules. But there's nothing in the genetic code that definitively says this person is Black or this person is Native American or anything else.
So as a sociologist, it shouldn't surprise us that you accept the notion that it's a social construct, that there are differences, different races. There's a lot of, I suppose, bad reasons and good reasons. They used race to categorize people. And that's fascinating in itself. I mean, the most obvious example I can think of is the former president, who, for all practical purposes, in terms of his place in history and how he's viewed, he is an African American. But we know he's not a total African American. He has white ancestors. But we do classify people that way. So as a sociologist, you understand it as a social construct and look at it in that context, right?
Yes, and I just want to emphasize that while I am a sociologist, this is a view that's supported by biological science.
Yes, right. The great quote from some sports writer a million years ago, when he heard the expression used a million times about Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion, he's a credit to his race. He finally said, yeah, the human race, which I thought really summed that up. So let's get to your work, Wendy, as a researcher. You looked at 23andMe and Ancestry.com, I guess, to see what people were getting out of this and how their attitudes and beliefs were changing. What did you find out?
So I didn't look at those particular companies,
okay,
but I did a couple of projects where I recruited people either who had bought genetic ancestry tests on their own from any company. And then I did another project later where I looked, just at white Americans. I invited them to participate in my study. None of them had taken genetic ancestry tests, but they were willing to. And then I randomly assigned them to either take a test or not. And I compared their responses before and after. And what I was really interested in is, how do these tests and their results affect people's racial and ethnic identities? How do they affect people's understanding of what race is? Does it lead people to think of race as being something that's determined by their genes? Or do they think of it more as a social construction or something that's not genetically determined? I was also interested in things like racial attitudes and whether it changes who they interact with. Like, does it actually change the diversity of their contacts and ties? So I've done a couple of different studies. I can tell you a little bit about the findings from the first study, if you like.
Sure.
So that was the one with people who had already taken these tests. And there I was really interested in how people made sense of the results that they got. And what I found was that despite a lot of the fears that some people had, that these tests are going to automatically geneticize race. Everybody is going to think that race is genetically determined again. I found that people were not automatically accepting whatever the test told them and thinking, oh, this is who I am. They were being a bit more selective. They were picking and choosing from the results, but really they were doing it in a way that was very consistent with social forces like who they wanted to be and how they thought the world would see them. So if somebody got a result that said you are part Jewish, they would think about their own feelings about the Jewish group. Did they like this group or not? Did they aspire to be a part of it and to make claims to being a member of the group? And they also thought about, are other people going to accept that? Are they going to look at me and say, yeah, you're Jewish? Or are they going to look at me and they're going to say, there's no way you could be Jewish because of how you look or how you act or whatever else. So they're not just being influenced by the test results and their ideas of what their genes say. They're also thinking about how the world sees them and what they want to be in the world.
Sure. It's like that uncertainty principle. They're changed by just the observation of this thing. Did you find people? I could see people being surprised by some of the things they would find. But speaking personally, I would be delighted to find out that I was all kinds of different people. I came from all different kinds of different places. I don't know that it would change it. Well, but I don't know, because first of all, I don't believe it would change a single thing in my life. It would make a bit of difference to me if I came from North Africa or Sicily or the British Isles. But it would be rich and interesting.
So I'll tell you the reason I ask you that is because I did find that in particular, the white people I interviewed who took these tests were particularly interested in finding a diverse history, finding things they didn't expect. They weren't just plain boring old,
white.
Right? They wanted to find something like interesting story that made them more
Absolutely.
diverse. And it was much more common among the white respondents I interviewed than any of the other people, Black, Latino, Native American, Asian. They often would say, I want to find relatives, or I want to connect to my history that's been lost, or I want to, find my birth parents or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, they weren't going in sort of looking to find something new and exciting or exotic.
Yeah. Well, our guest is Wendy Roth. Wendy's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a sociologist of race, ethnicity, and immigration. And she's talking to us about, broadly, our attitudes about race, how it affects us, and what we're learning through tracing our genetic ancestry through these now commercial operations. Wendy, let's pick up on this notion of how people reacted. Did you find examples of people who were upset at finding unexpected things in their ancestry?
Some people who didn't like what the tests were suggesting to them. And what most often happened in those cases was that they simply didn't believe them. They
Right.
said, that can't be right. That must be a mistake. I just don't believe it. Or they would explain it away somehow. But there were, people found a way to sort of get the answer that they wanted from these tests, whether it was by embracing the group they wanted or by refusing to believe the tests when they didn't like what they said.
Well, as a sociologist, do you think that to what extent are these tests more like the Inkblot tests?
Exactly. That's how I often describe them. I do think they're like those Rorschach blot tests, where people are looking at it and they're seeing what they want to see. And I think that goes for identity, but I also think that goes for the way that people think about race. Because another thing that I found is, there are a variety of different views about what race is in this society. Although I, will stand by my sociologist view and all the science that supports it, there still are people in the world who think that race is genetically determined and that there's a gene for being Black and there's a gene for being Asian and so on. And no matter how you go into taking these tests, whether you have that sort of biological definition of race, what some people would call an essentialist view of race, which believes that different racial groups have these sort of core essences, different personalities, different things they're good at or bad at, or some races are better at sports, or some races are inherently better at math, something like that. So that kind of an essentialist view, if you went into taking a test with that kind of a view, the testing experience reinforced your belief in that. And if you went into taking a test with more of a view that race is a social construction, that it's not biological at all, taking the test reinforced that view. You came out even more likely to believe that more strongly. So very much like a Rorschach blot, where, as with so much else in our society that is completely polarized into different ways of seeing the world, this is another thing that is sort of polarizing people even further into their own ways of seeing things.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about that, because these tests, which on the surface might appear to be a boon to understanding genetics and biology, turn out maybe to be less of that in terms of specificity or precision, and more an opportunity for people like you to go look at the way they're reacting to this. Look at what opinions they're forming as a base, out of what they're finding. I think that's the far more interesting thing and more valuable thing maybe about them. So for those people who take this, as you say, essentialist view, so that I understand this, that's the crowd that says genes are destiny, as opposed to another group who might say, no, character is destiny. How you behave is destiny. It doesn't make any difference what your genetic background is. Where are we? Do you see it divided that way?
Well, I would say with a little caveat, which is that, yes, I agree with you that the essentialists are people who say that genes are destiny. The people who have a more constructed view of race as a social construction, it's not that they don't say that genes don't affect intelligence or genes don't affect personality or athletic ability. They just say that that's not linked to these racial groups, right? So there might be a gene or a series of genes that affects intelligence, but that they're distributed across the human population and they're not associated with particular races in a way that is deterministic or definitive.
But can those genes be more prevalent in one group as opposed to another? How do you say that? May that distinction you made, that characteristic, be spread out and available everywhere, but more concentrated in one area than another? Is there any set?
So the science that we have on this points to the fact that there's no support for the idea that these particular genes that affect these complex characteristics, like musical ability or athletic ability, those are complex traits. And those complex traits developed way before the population migrations across the planet Earth, right? So you had those traits back before we had races. And the populations that spread out across the world took those traits with them. If we see concentrations today where it seems like this group is better at this or that group is better at that, that has much more to do with environment and what is encouraged among certain populations than
that's the nurture over the nature aspect. So that people understand that there is no math gene in Asians. There is no smart gene in Jews.
That's right.
But so as a sociologist who bores down deep into this, why do we cling to those ideas? Why is it so important to use race to define things?
It's easy. It's easy to look at somebody in front of us and try to put them in a box, try to put them in a category. As with so many other rules of thumb or heuristics that we use to try to make our life simpler, this is one that people use all the time. And, stereotypes, unfortunately, exist for a reason. Unfortunately, when it comes to race, exist for a reason. They exist because they make our thinking and our thought processes easier if we can kind of use these shortcuts. Oh, well, I see this a lot, so therefore I'm going to think that fits into this group like all the other things I see that look like that. It's basically a shortcut or a rule of thumb if you just take it at its most basic level, but then that doesn't factor in all the ways that these stereotypes can be abused or used for certain purposes or used by people in power to get what they want, whether it's political control or whether it's a workforce that behaves a certain way. I mean, those things definitely play a strong role too.
The power dynamic is interesting because you're right. In order to achieve and then maintain power, it's important to have your definitions clear about who you want up or who you want down. This is a very deep thing, isn't it? This is I guess it goes back to this fear of the other. That's not me. It's a threat. I need to identify the other so I'm safe.
Yep.
Is that what we're seeing?
I mean, I think that is very much at the root of a lot of our discussions on race and ethnicity and even genetics to some extent.
Yes.
Is this feeling of wanting to find a place of belonging and safety and security by saying, this is me, and I will establish closer ties and closer connections to the people in this group by defining ourselves as different from some other group. I mean, that's, where nations come from, right? The idea that if we define ourselves in a certain way and we set the boundaries, then we can promote patriotism and nationalism that'll get people to go to war, in the name of this identity we all have. So it's a very powerful feeling. And, it comes out in many forms, but I think that race is clearly one.
Yeah. And one of the fields that I know you are expert in is immigration. All of what you just said is interesting for those of us who, most people can't get our heads around the continuing racial problems that we have in this country. But if you step back for a second, it's regrettable but it can be understood, I think, in the sense of here's a country that was dedicated to the proposition that everybody can come here from anywhere and we'll sort of get along together. And race and ethnicity and religion wasn't supposed to matter. And for a couple of hundred years, it seems to have held together. But now it's straining, isn't it? There's a strain on that idea right now, isn't there?
I believe so. I believe that that idea is being challenged in part because that idea existed at a time when, there was this feeling that this land needed to be settled, right? I'm not suggesting that there weren't people here already, but there was this feeling of, we can open our borders to anyone because we need people to come in here and settle this land and, sort of create a country for a purpose. Now that condition doesn't seem to be there as much. And so, of course, it makes sense that people would suddenly think differently. Well, not so suddenly, but would start to think differently about immigration. But getting back to the point you were raising before, too, about feelings of threat for who is and who isn't in your group. I think a lot of our discussions about immigration stem from that. And, the way some people think that the country might be changing in terms of those categories that get drawn.
Let's, I want to sort of wrap this up because I know you're very busy. With regard to people who are interested in one of these companies, it's a big deal, by the way, it's a multi-billion-dollar company now. What advice would you give them by way of, expectation and caution if they said, I'm going to do this?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, once you open that envelope or you open up that email, you can never go back, right? So if there is anything you could imagine that you could find out that you don't want to know, then really think carefully. There are a lot of people who find out that their parents are not their parents, or a sibling is not a sibling, or that they were adopted, or, there are a number of stories like that, situations like that of people whose lives are completely upended. So you really should think very seriously about that as a possibility. Secondly, I think that there are ways to go about taking these tests if you're going to do it. There are a lot of people who are very mindful of using this information as just one tool as part of a larger picture to understand their family or who they are. They're combining this information with a historical record, with genealogical information. They're using it in order to connect to distant relatives and fill in their family trees. And that can be quite useful. There are a lot of people who find distant relatives. I've found a cousin of my father's who I'd never met before and have become very close with. And it's amazing. It's an amazing experience. But I think that it's valuable if you're going into it with that in mind, and not if you're going into this thinking that this test is going to tell me who I am, or it's going to tell me something about my race or ethnicity, because it really doesn't do that.
Well, thank you so much. As I told you earlier, I'm the sort of person who, might be mildly interested in this. I told my wife the other night, I might do it if there were any chance at all. The results would come back and determine that I was Bill Gates's long lost cousin or something. But anyway, Wendy Roth of the University of Pennsylvania, this is a great topic, and we've just scratched the surface. Your work is, as I said, I saw it through a link from the New York Times article about this. It's just fascinating. I know it's ongoing for you. Thanks so much for your time. And maybe we can do this again.
My pleasure. I'd like it. Yeah.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Every storm runs out of rain, according to the great Maya Angelou. Her words can remind us of one very simple truth, that storms do cross our paths, but they don't last forever. So the question remains, how do we ride out this storm of COVID-19 and all the other storms life may throw our way? Where do we turn when issues such as mental health or substance abuse begin to deeply affect our lives? Look to Retreat Behavioral Health. With a team of industry-leading experts, they work tirelessly to provide compassionate, holistic, and affordable treatment. Call to learn more today. 855-802-6600. Retreat Behavioral Health, where healing happens.